There are certain nights that change everything, though you never know it while you're living them. This was late October, the kind of evening where rain doesn't just fall, but pours like something broken open in the sky. I stood in my hallway, barefoot on the old hardwood floors that creaked no matter how carefully I walked. The tea in my hands had gone lukewarm an hour ago, but I kept holding the mug anyway, finding comfort in its weight, its familiarity. Outside, the rain had found its rhythm against the windows, against the roof, against the world. It was the kind of sound that made you feel both sheltered and trapped, safe in your small circle of lamplight, but aware of how thin the walls really were. I had been listening to it for hours, letting it wash over the silence of my house like a lullaby I'd grown too old for. Then came the knocking. 3 deliberate raps on my front door, measured and patient. Not the hurried knock of someone seeking shelter from the storm, not the urgent pounding of an emergency. Just 3 sounds that cut through the rain's steady voice and made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't name. I set the mug down on the narrow table by the stairs, my hand steadier than I felt. 20 years of living alone teaches you to be cautious about unexpected visitors, especially in a town like Ashford where everyone knows everyone else's business and strangers are noticed before they've even parked their cars. But something about those 3 knocks felt different. Familiar, maybe. Or maybe that was just my imagination filling the spaces between what I hoped for and what I feared. I opened the door, and there he was. Gabriel Winters, standing on my doorstep like a ghost made flesh, soaked through to the bone. His dark hair was plastered against his forehead, water dripping from the ends and catching the porch light. His breath came out in small white clouds that disappeared as quickly as they formed. He looked older, thinner, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before and a faint scar along his jawline that caught shadows in the dim light. For a moment, neither of us moved. I felt my hand tighten on the door frame, felt my body preparing to step backward, to close the door, to protect the quiet life I had built so carefully over the years. This was Gabriel Winters, the same Gabriel who had left this town under a cloud of whispers and accusations. The same Gabriel who had been my rival, my opposite, my closest thing to an enemy for most of our youth. The same Gabriel I hadn't seen in nearly 20 years, not since that final argument that ended with shouting and slammed doors and him driving away in the middle of the night. He said my name then, just Nathaniel, spoken so softly it was almost lost in the sound of the rain. But there was something in his voice, something that sounded like an apology or a question or maybe both. It was enough to keep my hand from closing the door, enough to keep me standing there, looking at him, seeing the boy I once knew somewhere in the man he had become. The air between us was thick with everything we had never said to each other, all the words that had been swallowed by pride and time and the particular cruelty of small towns. I could feel them there, hovering in the space between the doorframe and where he stood, waiting. 20 years collapsed into this single moment, this threshold where past and present met like 2 weather fronts creating their own storm. I remembered the last time I had seen him, the way his face had looked in the harsh fluorescent light of the town hall, the way his voice had carried across the room when he stood up to defend something I couldn't bring myself to believe in. I remembered the accusations that followed, the whispers that trailed behind both of us for months afterward, the way the town had chosen sides without knowing the whole truth. I remembered how he had looked at me that final night, standing in this same doorway, his eyes full of something that might have been disappointment or might have been grief. Now here he was again, water pooling at his feet on my porch, his clothes clinging to his frame, looking like he had walked through more than just rain to get here. There was something different about him, something quieter, more careful. The sharp edges of his youth had been worn smooth by whatever years he had lived away from this place, away from me. I realized I was still holding my breath, still gripping the door frame like it was the only thing keeping me anchored to the ground. The rational part of my mind cataloged all the reasons to send him away, the late hour, the storm, the history between us, the carefully constructed peace I had built in his absence. But there was another part of me, a part one had buried so deep I had almost forgotten it existed, that recognized something in his eyes. Something that looked like the boy who used to sit beside me in the library, reading books neither of us fully understood, but pretending we did. My house sits on the outskirts of Ashford like a quiet apology for existing. It's a weathered colonial that I inherited from my grandmother, with white clapboard siding that needs painting and black shutters that hang slightly crooked no matter how many times I adjust them. The front porch sags in the middle, and the steps creak under even the lightest footfall, but it's mine in a way that nothing else has ever been. 3 bedrooms upstairs, though I only use one. A kitchen with windows that face east so I can watch the sunrise while my coffee brews. A living room where I sit most evenings, reading by the light of a single lamp while the radio plays something soft and forgettable in the background. This is where I built my life after Gabriel left. Carefully, deliberately, like someone constructing a house of cards who knows that one wrong move will bring it all down. Every morning I wake at 6:15, shower, dress in the same rotation of pressed shirts and dark pants that hang in my closet like a uniform. I straighten the picture frames in the hallway before I leave, though they're never actually crooked. I polish the kitchen counters until they gleam, though they're never really dirty. These rituals have become my armor, small acts of control in a world that taught me early how quickly control can be taken away. Ashford is the kind of New England town that appears on postcards and in movies about simple living and moral complexity. Main Street lined with maple trees that turn brilliant red each October. A white steepled church that rings its bells every Sunday morning and Wednesday evening, the sound carrying across the hills like a reminder of who we're supposed to be. Shops with hand-painted signs and owners who know 3 generations of your family's business. It's beautiful in the way that careful things are beautiful, maintained and preserved and presented to the world as proof that some places still hold on to their values. But every small town has its shadows, and Ashford's run deeper than most people want to acknowledge. This is a place where memory is both blessing and curse, where your grandfather's reputation can lift you up or drag you down 60 years after he's gone, where whispers travel faster than news and last longer than truth, where being different isn't necessarily forbidden, but it's noticed, cataloged, filed away for future reference. I learned these rules early, learned them the hard way, and I've spent the better part of 20 years following them without complaint. I work at the Ashford Public Library, a Carnegie building with tall windows and dark wood shelves that smell like old paper and lemon oil. My official title is archivist, which means I spend my days in the basement, cataloging donations and organizing collections that most people will never see. Historical documents, old photographs, boxes of letters from families who want their stories preserved but not necessarily shared. It suits me, this work with the past, this quiet communion with people who are safely dead and cannot disappoint or be disappointed. The head librarian, Mrs. Chun, hired me 12 years ago when I moved back to town after graduate school. She's kind in a professional way, the sort of person who remembers your birthday and asks about your health, but never pries deeper than surface conversation. Most days we work in parallel silence. She upstairs helping patrons find bestsellers and tax forms, me downstairs making order from chaos one manila folder at a time. Sometimes I hear children's voices drifting down during story hour, and I pause in my work to listen to the sound of unburdened laughter. My evenings follow the same pattern they have for years. Home by 5:30. Dinner for 1, usually something simple that doesn't require much attention. The local news on the radio while I eat, though I rarely listen closely enough to retain what I've heard. Afterward, I read in my chair by the living room window, or sometimes I sit on the back porch if the weather is mild, watching the light fade from the sky while the sounds of other people's lives drift across the yards. Doors closing, televisions turning on, the distant voices of families settling into their own evening routines. I have no photographs of friends on my walls, no pictures of parties or celebrations or moments of spontaneous joy. Instead, there are landscapes I bought at the antique shop on Main Street, still lives of flowers and fruit painted by artists whose names are forgotten. Safe images that reveal nothing about who I am or what I want or whom I might love. Even my books, when I look at them honestly, are chosen more for what they don't say about me than what they do. The closest I come to real connection is through my sister Elise, who lives 15 minutes away in a blue cottage with a vegetable garden and a daughter named Sophie, who turned 8 this summer. Elise is 3 years younger than me, but seems to have figured out things about living that still puzzle me. She divorced her husband when Sophie was 4, not because he was cruel, but because she said she felt like she was disappearing a little more each day. Now she works as a physical therapist and raises her daughter and brings both of them into my careful life like bursts of unexpected color. Sophie has Elise's dark hair and curious eyes, and she moves through my house like she belongs there, which both delights and terrifies me. She asks questions I don't know how to answer and tells me stories about school that make me remember what it felt like to be young and unguarded. When she visits, she rearranges my books by color instead of title, leaves her drawings on my refrigerator, fills the silence with chatter about her friends and her teacher and the elaborate games she plays at recess. Elise watches me with her daughter, and I can see her trying to understand the careful distance I maintain even with them. She brings dinner sometimes, or suggests we take Sophie to the park, or asks if I want to come to Sophie's school play. I always say yes, because I love them both in a way that feels safe and manageable, but I also feel the familiar tightness in my chest that comes with being seen too clearly by people who matter. She doesn't ask about my solitude directly, but I catch her looking at me sometimes with an expression that might be worry or might be pity. Once, when Sophie was playing in the backyard and we were sitting on the porch with coffee, Elise said she wished I would let someone take care of me for a change. I told her I took care of myself just fine, and she smiled in that way that meant she didn't believe me but wouldn't push further. This is the life I built after Gabriel left, and for 20 years it has been enough. Predictable, contained, safe. A life where I know the rules and follow them, where I am polite but not warm, helpful but not vulnerable, present but never truly exposed. It has served its purpose, this careful existence, protecting me from the kind of pain that comes with wanting too much or trusting too deeply or believing that someone might see all of you and choose to stay anyway. Gabriel's arrival wasn't the accident I tried to convince myself it was. 3 days earlier, I had found something in my mailbox that made my hands shake as I carried in the rest of the mail. Wedged between a utility bill and a catalog I never ordered was a postcard, black and white, showing the Ashford train station as it looked in the 1950s. The same station where I caught the bus to college, where I returned 4 years later with a degree I didn't know how to use and a heart that felt too heavy for my chest. There was no message on the back, just my name written in handwriting I recognized immediately. The same careful script that had filled the margins of books we shared in high school. The same loops and angles that had signed birthday cards when we were still young enough to celebrate each other's existence. The postmark was from Millfield, one town over, dated 2 days prior. I stared at it for a long time, sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee growing cold, trying to decide what it meant and what I was supposed to do with the knowledge that Gabriel was close enough to drive here in 20 minutes. I threw it away without telling anyone. Not Elise, not Mrs. Chun, not even myself, really. I buried it under coffee grounds and junk mail and tried to forget that I had ever seen it. But for 3 days, every sound outside made me look toward the windows. Every knock on the door, every car that slowed down in front of my house, every footstep on the sidewalk made my pulse quicken with something that felt like anticipation and terror in equal measure. Now here he was, standing on my doorstep like a question I wasn't ready to answer. He asked if he could come in, just for the night, just until the rain stopped and the roads cleared. His voice was quieter than I remembered, rougher around the edges, but somehow gentler too. He said he understood if I said no, that he wouldn't blame me, that he probably didn't have the right to ask. But there was something in his eyes, something that looked like the exhaustion that comes from carrying heavy things for too long, that made it impossible for me to close the door. I stepped aside and let him in. He dripped water on my grandmother's hardwood floors while I found towels, while I pointed him toward the bathroom, while I put the kettle on and tried to remember how to be a host to someone who had once known me better than I knew myself. When he emerged from the bathroom 20 minutes later, his hair was dry and he was wearing clothes from a bag he had left by the front door. A simple sweater and jeans that made him look both older and younger than the soaked stranger who had appeared in the storm. We sat in my kitchen drinking weak tea from mismatched cups, the silence between us punctuated by the steady drumming of rain against the windows. I found myself studying his face in the lamplight, cataloging the changes that 20 years had made. The scar along his jawline that caught shadows when he turned his head. The lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into too many sunrises. The way his hands wrapped around the teacup, steadier than they used to be, but somehow more careful, as if he had learned not to take warmth for granted. Looking at him brought back memories I had spent years learning to ignore. Gabriel and I had been rivals long before we were anything else. Academic competitions where we pushed each other toward excellence and resentment in equal measure. Debate tournaments where we argued opposite sides of questions we both believed in, just for the pleasure of watching the other person's certainty waver. Student council elections where we split the votes so evenly that neither of us won, which somehow felt like the most honest outcome possible. But our rivalry had been more than intellectual. It was personal in ways I didn't understand until years later, when I finally had words for the feelings that had driven so much of my anger toward him. We argued about everything. Books, politics, the future of our dying town, whether it was better to leave or stay, to fight or to compromise. I remembered shouting matches during town meetings when we were barely old enough to have opinions that mattered. The way his voice would rise when he thought I was being naive. The way mine would sharpen when I thought he was being reckless. The worst of it came during our senior year, when Gabriel started pushing for changes that the town wasn't ready to accept. He wrote letters to the newspaper about discrimination and small-mindedness, organized meetings that most people refused to attend, spoke at town hall about tolerance and inclusion in language that made the older residents shift uncomfortably in their seats. I admired his courage and resented it at the same time, because I could see what it was costing him and I was too afraid to stand beside him when it might have mattered. The final argument happened right here, in this kitchen, on a night much like this one. Gabriel had come to ask for my support for something I can't even remember now, some petition or protest that felt too dangerous for someone like me to sign. We shouted at each other across this same table, him accusing me of cowardice, me accusing him of self-destruction. He left angry, and I let him go, and 2 days later he was gone from town entirely, taking nothing but a suitcase and leaving behind whispers that followed both our names for months afterward. Now, 20 years later, he was back in my kitchen, older and quieter, and somehow more present than he had ever been when we were young. We didn't talk about the past directly, not that first night. Instead, we spoke carefully about safer things. The storm, the state of the roads, how the town had changed in his absence. But underneath our polite conversation, I could feel something shifting, some tectonic plate of old resentment beginning to move. When he asked if he could sleep on my couch, I said yes without thinking about it too hard. I gave him blankets and a pillow that smelled like the cedar chest where I kept them, showed him where the bathroom was, told him to help himself to anything he needed from the kitchen. I went upstairs to my own room and lay awake listening to the rain, listening to the old house settling around us both, listening to the sound of someone else breathing under my roof for the first time in longer than I wanted to calculate. I didn't sleep much that night, but it wasn't because I was afraid. It was because something that had been frozen inside me for 20 years was beginning to thaw, and I could feel it moving through my chest like water finding its way through ice. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something that might eventually become forgiveness if I was brave enough to let it grow. One night became 2, then 3, then a week. The rain that had brought Gabriel to my doorstep settled over Ashford like a gray blanket, turning the roads into rivers and the creek behind my house into something wild and impassable. The local news reported flooding in 3 counties, bridge closures, evacuation warnings for the low-lying areas near the reservoir. It was the kind of weather that made leaving feel impossible and staying feel inevitable, as if the sky itself had conspired to keep us in the same space until we figured out what to do with each other. We developed a routine without discussing it, the way people do when they're trying to be considerate while navigating unfamiliar territory. I woke at my usual time and made coffee for two instead of one, leaving a cup on the counter before I showered and dressed for work. Gabriel was always awake when I came downstairs, sitting at the kitchen table with yesterday's newspaper or one of the books he'd pulled from my shelves, his hair still messy from sleep, but his eyes alert in a way that suggested he'd been awake longer than he let on. He never asked to come to the library with me, and I never offered, but somehow it became understood that he would spend his days working on things around my house that I had been putting off for months. The back fence that had been leaning toward the Hendersons' yard since the last big storm. The loose shingle on the north side of the roof that I kept meaning to call someone about. The front steps that creaked so loudly that I had learned to distribute my weight carefully to avoid waking the neighbors when I came home late. I would leave for work each morning and return each evening to find small improvements, careful repairs that spoke of time spent thoughtfully rather than just time passed. Gabriel had always been good with his hands in a way that I envied, able to see problems and solutions where I saw only things that needed to be endured. When we were teenagers, he had rebuilt the engine of his father's old pickup truck in the winter's driveway, spending entire weekends bent over the open hood with tools spread around him like surgical instruments. Now I would come home to find him cleaning those same tools at my kitchen sink, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his hands stained with oil or dirt or would stain. He would look up when I walked in and offer a small smile that never quite reached his eyes, as if he were asking permission for something he had already done. I would ask about his day, and he would tell me about the particular stubbornness of my fence posts, the way the wood had swollen from years of rain and needed to be coaxed back into alignment. These were safe conversations, practical and immediate, but underneath them I could hear something else, the careful attention of someone who was taking care of my life in ways I had forgotten to ask for. In the evenings, we would sit in my living room with books or newspapers, the radio playing something quiet between us. Sometimes Gabriel would ask about my work, about the collections I was organizing or the stories I found in donated boxes. I told him about the Civil War letters I had discovered in the Hartwell donation, written by a local soldier to his wife, full of homesickness and small observations about Army life that made the war feel suddenly personal and immediate. I told him about the photograph albums from the Morrison family, documenting 5 generations of Ashford residents, faces that looked familiar even though I couldn't always place the names. Gabriel listened with the same intensity he had brought to everything when we were young, asking questions that showed he understood not just what I was telling him, but why it mattered to me. He seemed to grasp that my work was less about preserving history than about finding meaning in the fragments that people leave behind, the small evidence of lives lived with intention and care. When I talked about these things, I could feel myself opening in ways I hadn't in years, sharing thoughts I usually kept locked away in the basement of the library with the boxes and files. Gradually, carefully, we began to speak about the past, though never directly about the argument that had driven us apart or the reasons he had left town. Instead, we talked about the people we had been before everything went wrong, the dreams we had carried, and the assumptions we had made about how our lives would unfold. Gabriel told me about the year after graduation when he had planned to study engineering, how he had filled out applications and written essays about building bridges and designing structures that would outlast the people who used them. I learned that he had spent the last 20 years moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots or accumulate more possessions than would fit in his truck. Construction work mostly, sometimes carpentry, occasionally teaching himself new skills when the work demanded it. He had lived in 12 different states, he said, renting rooms and small apartments, sending postcards to no one, making friends he would eventually leave behind. There was a weariness in his voice when he talked about this nomadic life, but also something that might have been relief, as if the constant movement had protected him from having to explain himself to anyone for more than a few months at a time. One evening, when the rain had been falling steadily for 5 days and showed no signs of stopping, Gabriel offered to cook dinner. I had been planning to make pasta with Jared's sauce, my usual fallback when I was too tired to think about food, but he asked if I had ingredients for something more substantial. I showed him what was in my pantry and refrigerator, the the basic supplies of someone who cooked for survival rather than pleasure, and watched him assess the possibilities with the same careful attention he had given to my broken fence. He made chicken with herbs I didn't know I had, vegetables roasted until they caramelized, rice that somehow turned out fluffy instead of sticky. While he cooked, I sat at the kitchen table and watched him move around my space with an ease that both comforted and unsettled me. He seemed to know instinctively where I kept things, or maybe he just had the kind of confidence that comes from adapting quickly to new environments. When he couldn't find something, he would ask quietly, and when I pointed him toward the right cabinet or drawer, he would nod his thanks without making it feel like an intrusion. The meal was better than anything I had eaten in my own kitchen in years, maybe ever. We ate by candlelight because the power had flickered earlier and neither of us had bothered to turn the electricity back on when it returned. The rain drummed against the windows and the house felt smaller and larger at the same time, intimate in a way that made me hyper-aware of every sound and silence between us. Gabriel talked about places he had lived, cities and small towns that had taught him different lessons about what it meant to belong somewhere. I found myself telling him about the books I read, the quiet pleasure I took in my work, the way Elisa's daughter made me remember what it felt like to see the world with fresh eyes. After dinner, Gabriel insisted on washing the dishes while I dried them and put them away. We stood side by side at the kitchen sink, our sleeves rolled up, our hands occasionally brushing when we reached for the same plate or cup. It was such an ordinary moment, the kind of domestic scene that married couples probably took for granted, but for me it felt revolutionary. I couldn't remember the last time someone had cooked for me, or the last time I had shared a meal that felt like celebration rather than mere sustenance. Later that week, Gabriel started staying at the library after closing time. It began accidentally, when he came to walk me home during a particularly heavy downpour and arrived a few minutes before I was ready to leave. Mrs. Chun had already gone home, and the building was empty except for us. Gabriel wandered the stacks while I finished cataloging a box of documents, running his fingers along the spines of books, pausing occasionally to pull one from the shelf and read the first page or flip through the illustrations. When I finished my work and found him in the poetry section, he was reading something by Robert Frost, his lips moving slightly, as if he were testing the rhythm of the words. He looked up when I approached, and for a moment our eyes held in a way that felt both familiar and completely new. There was something in his gaze that I recognized from our teenage years, an intensity that had always made me feel seen and exposed at the same time. But now it was tempered with a patience that hadn't been there before. He closed the book and put it back on the shelf, but slowly, as if he were reluctant to break whatever spell the moment had cast. When he asked if I was ready to go, his voice was softer than usual, and when I said yes, he waited for me to turn off the lights and lock the doors with a courtesy that felt almost formal, as if he understood that something fragile was growing between us and didn't want to be the one to damage it through carelessness. These moments began to accumulate over the days that followed. Gabriel appearing in my peripheral vision while I worked, not interrupting, but simply present in a way that made the familiar space of the library feel charged with possibility. Conversations that started about practical things and drifted toward more personal territory. Silences that felt comfortable rather than awkward, as if we were both learning to be in the same space without constantly defining what that meant or where it might lead. I began to realize that something fundamental was changing in me. Some internal landscape that had been frozen for 20 years was beginning to thaw. It wasn't dramatic, this transformation, not the kind of sudden revelation that happens in movies or novels. Instead, it was gradual, incremental, like watching ice melt or flowers bloom, so slow that you only noticed it had happened when you looked back and saw how far you had traveled from where you started. The revelation came on a Thursday night, in the least cinematic way possible. I had been telling myself that whatever was happening between Gabriel and me was temporary, manageable, something that would resolve itself when the weather cleared and he continued on to wherever he had been traveling before the storm brought him to my door. But revelations, I learned, don't announce themselves with fanfare. They arrive quietly, in moments when your defenses are down and your heart is unprepared for the weight of truth. The power went out just as we were finishing dinner. Not the flickering uncertainty of an overloaded grid, but the sudden, complete darkness that comes when transformers blow and entire neighborhoods disappear into blackness. We sat in my kitchen for a moment, listening to the rain drumming against the windows with renewed intensity, waiting to see if the electricity would return on its own. When it didn't, I fumbled through the junk drawer for the flashlight I kept for emergencies, its weak beam revealing Gabriel's face across the table, calm and patient in the sudden darkness. We found candles in the pantry, the emergency supplies I had accumulated over years of living alone and being prepared for solitude. Gabriel helped me light them and arrange them around the living room, transforming my familiar space into something that felt both intimate and strange, shadows dancing across walls that looked different in the flickering light. We settled onto the couch with our coffee cups, the storm raging outside while inside we existed in a small circle of warmth and yellow light. For a while we didn't speak, just listened to the rain and the wind and the occasional crack of branches giving way under the weight of too much water. There was something about the darkness that made words feel both more necessary and more dangerous, as if the usual boundaries that governed our careful conversations had been temporarily suspended. Gabriel sat at the other end of the couch, far enough away to be respectful, close enough that I could see the candlelight reflected in his eyes when he turned to look at me. Then, without preamble, he began to talk about the night he left town. Not the argument we had shared in this same room, but what had happened afterward, the events that had driven him to pack his few belongings and leave Ashford in the middle of the night without saying goodbye to anyone. His voice was steady, measured, as if he had practiced these words many times but never found the right audience for them until now. He told me about stopping at Murphy's Tavern after our fight, needing a drink and the kind of anonymous comfort that only dive bars provide. How he had sat in a corner booth, nursing a beer and trying to decide whether our friendship was worth salvaging or whether some things were too broken to repair. How he had overheard a conversation at the bar between three men I would have recognized, town fixtures who had opinions about everyone and everything, their voices carrying the particular authority that comes with alcohol and assumed privacy. They were talking about me, about my family, my habits, the careful way I moved through town as if I were afraid of being noticed, about speculation that had followed me since high school, whispers about why I never dated anyone seriously, why I spent so much time alone, why I seemed more comfortable with books than people. They used words that made Gabriel's hands tighten around his beer bottle. Casual cruelty delivered with the confidence of men who had never questioned their right to judge other people's lives. But it wasn't just gossip, Gabriel said. They were discussing practical matters, the kind of concrete consequences that small-town disapproval could bring. One of them mentioned my job at the library, wondered aloud if someone like me should be working around children during story hour. Another talked about property values, how certain kinds of people could affect a neighborhood's reputation. The third, whose voice Gabriel recognized as belonging to a town selectman, suggested that perhaps it was time someone had a conversation with me about expectations and community standards. Gabriel had left the bar that night understanding something that I had been too naive or too hopeful to see clearly, that my careful life, my quiet existence, my attempts to blend into the background had not protected me the way I thought they had. That there were people in this town who had been watching me, cataloging my differences, waiting for an excuse to act on their suspicions. That the freedom I thought I had earned through good behavior and discretion was more fragile than I had ever imagined. He told me all of this in the candlelit darkness of my living room, his voice growing quieter as the story continued, as if he could minimize the harm of these revelations by speaking them softly enough. When he finished, the silence between us felt heavy with 20 years of misunderstanding, 20 years of me believing he had abandoned our friendship out of anger or disappointment, when in truth he had been trying to protect me in the only way he knew how. I felt something crack open inside my chest, some carefully constructed wall that had been holding back emotions I hadn't even known I was carrying. All those years of wondering what I had done wrong, what I could have said differently, why someone I had cared about so deeply had found it so easy to walk away from our connection. All those years of believing that Gabriel's departure was proof that I was too much trouble, too complicated, too dangerous to love. Gabriel moved closer on the couch then, not touching me, but eliminating the careful distance he had been maintaining for the past week. In the candlelight, his face looked both older and younger than it had when he arrived on my doorstep, marked by whatever he had experienced in the years since leaving, but also somehow more open, as if telling me this truth had lifted a weight he had been carrying for too long. He said he was sorry for leaving without explaining, sorry for letting me believe that our argument had been unforgivable, sorry for all the years of silence that had stretched between us like a canyon that seemed too wide to bridge. He said he had thought about writing letters, making phone calls, finding ways to stay connected that wouldn't put me at risk, but that everything he considered felt either too dangerous or too inadequate for what he wanted to say. When he reached for my hand, it wasn't a sudden gesture or a moment of overwhelming passion. It was careful, deliberate, the way someone might offer comfort to a person who had been in pain for so long they had forgotten what healing felt like. His palm was warm against mine, slightly rough from the work he had been doing around my house, familiar in a way that made my breath catch in my throat. I looked at our joined hands in the flickering candlelight and understood something that changed everything I thought I knew about my own story. Gabriel had never been my enemy, never been the rival or adversary I had convinced myself he was during those bitter teenage years. He had been the only person who saw me clearly, who understood what I was facing in a town that demanded conformity as the price of belonging. Our arguments hadn't been about intellectual differences or personality conflicts. They had been about love, about fear, about the terrible vulnerability of caring for someone in a world that punished certain kinds of caring. All those years of rivalry and competition, all those shouting matches and moments of frustrated anger, had been two young people trying to protect each other in the only ways they knew how, circling around feelings they didn't have words for and couldn't safely express. Gabriel's departure hadn't been abandonment. It had been sacrifice, the kind of impossible choice between protecting someone you love and staying close enough to be heard alongside them. The rain continued to fall outside, but something in the atmosphere of my small house had shifted permanently. 20 years of frozen grief was beginning to thaw, and with it came the terrible, wonderful possibility that some stories could be rewritten, that some losses could be recovered, that some kinds of love were strong enough to survive even the longest silences. The storm broke on Friday morning, leaving behind the kind of crystalline air that makes everything look washed clean and newly made. I woke to sunlight streaming through my bedroom windows for the first time in over a week, the sky a pale blue that seemed to promise better days ahead. From downstairs came the sound of Gabriel making coffee, the familiar morning ritual we had fallen into without discussing its temporary nature. When I came down to the kitchen, he was standing by the window, looking out at the yard where puddles reflected the morning light like scattered mirrors. He turned when he heard my footsteps, offering me the same careful smile he had given me every morning since the night of the revelation. But there was something different in his expression now, something that looked like resolve mixed with regret. "The roads are clear," he said without preamble. He had checked the local news, called the highway department, confirmed what we could both see from the brightness of the day. The world had opened up again, and there was no longer any practical reason for him to stay. He said he would leave that morning, pack his few belongings, and continue on to wherever he had been traveling before the storm brought him to my doorstep. He said it kindly, matter-of-factly, as if we were discussing the weather rather than the end of something that had been quietly transforming us both. I nodded and poured my coffee, keeping my hand steady and my voice neutral when I said that of course he should go, that he had probably already stayed longer than he intended. But inside, something was crumbling, some foundation I had been building without realizing it was already supporting more weight than I had imagined possible. The prospect of returning to my solitary routine, of eating dinner alone and reading in the evenings without the quiet presence of someone else breathing in the next room, felt suddenly unbearable in a way that surprised me with its intensity. I went to work that morning in a fog that had nothing to do with the weather. Mrs. Chin commented on how distracted I seemed, how I kept staring at the same page of catalog entries without making any progress. She asked if I was feeling well, if I needed to go home early, if there was anything she could do to help. I told her I was fine, just tired from the storm and the unusual week, but I could see in her eyes that she didn't believe me. I spent the day mechanically shelving books whose titles I didn't register, organizing files whose contents meant nothing to me, going through the motions of my carefully ordered life while my mind remained fixed on Gabriel's impending departure. I kept thinking about the previous night, the weight of his hand in mine, the way 20 years of misunderstanding had dissolved in the space between one breath and the next. I kept thinking about what it would mean to let him go again, to return to the safety of my solitude and the comfortable prison of other people's expectations. By closing time, I had made no decision about what to say or do. I locked the library and drove home through streets that still showed evidence of the storm's passage. Fallen branches, scattered leaves, the detritus of a week when nature had reminded us how little control we actually had over our carefully planned lives. Gabriel's truck was still in my driveway, but I didn't know if that meant he had changed his mind or simply hadn't finished packing yet. I found him in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for what looked like one last dinner together. He looked up when I walked in, his expression cautious but warm, as if he were trying to read my mood without asking direct questions that might make things more complicated than they already were. We moved around each other in the familiar dance of meal preparation, but with an underlying tension that hadn't been there during the comfortable domesticity of the previous week. Elise arrived just as we were sitting down to eat, appearing at my back door without warning in the way she sometimes did when she wanted to check on me. Her smile faltered when she saw Gabriel at my kitchen table, his presence clearly unexpected and unwelcome. I watched recognition dawn on her face, followed by something that looked like concern mixed with disapproval. She remembered the old stories, the whispers that had followed both our names 20 years ago, the reasons people had been relieved when Gabriel left town and stayed gone. Dinner became an exercise in polite conversation stretched over a foundation of unspoken tension. Elise was cordial to Gabriel in the way she would be to any guest in my home, but I could see her studying him when she thought he wasn't looking, cataloging the changes 20 years had made and perhaps wondering what his return to my life might mean. Gabriel, for his part, seemed to understand the dynamics at play and kept his responses brief and courteous, not trying to charm her, but not retreating into silence either. After we finished eating, Elise asked if she could speak with me privately. We stepped out onto the back porch while Gabriel cleared the dishes, the evening air still carrying the fresh smell of rain-washed earth. For a moment, we stood there listening to the sounds of my neighborhood settling into evening. Televisions turning on, doors closing, the distant voices of families beginning their bedtime routines. Then Elise turned to me with the expression she wore when she was about to say something she thought I needed to hear whether I wanted to or not. She asked if I was sure about letting someone like him back into my life, her voice gentle but her meaning unmistakable. She reminded me that people in town had long memories, that there had been talk when Gabriel left, that his return might stir up gossip I had spent years learning to avoid. She said she was worried about me, about the quiet peace I had built for myself, about whether I was prepared for the complications that someone like Gabriel would inevitably bring. Her words cut deeper than she realized, not because they were cruel, but because they echoed fears I had been carrying for 20 years. Someone like him. Someone like us. The careful euphemisms that people used when they wanted to express disapproval without having to name exactly what they disapproved of. I understood that Elise meant well, that she was trying to protect me from pain and judgment and the kind of scrutiny that could make life in a small town unbearable. But I also understood that her protection came with a price, the surrender of any possibility of genuine connection, genuine love, genuine life. After Elise left, I went upstairs and lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, listening to Gabriel moving quietly around my house, cleaning up from dinner, perhaps beginning to pack his belongings for tomorrow's departure. I thought about the life I had built here, safe and solitary and acceptable to people who would never really know me. I thought about the alternative, the risk of choosing connection over security, love over reputation, truth over the comfortable lies that had sustained me for so long. I realized that I had spent 20 years living by the rules of people who had never cared enough to know who I really was or what I really wanted. I had shaped my existence around the expectations of neighbors who saw me as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be understood. I had accepted loneliness as the price of belonging, isolation as the cost of peace, and somewhere along the way I had forgotten that there might be other options, other ways of being in the world that didn't require me to disappear a little more each day. In the early hours of the morning, when the house was silent except for the settling sounds that old buildings make in the darkness, I went downstairs and found Gabriel in the living room, packing his few belongings into the same worn duffel bag he had carried when he arrived. He looked up when he heard my footsteps, his hands stilling on the clothes he was folding, his expression carefully neutral. I stood there in my pajamas and bare feet, looking at this man who had traveled back into my life like an answer to a question I had been afraid to ask. The decision, when it came, was both harder and easier than I had expected. Harder because it meant choosing uncertainty over the security I had spent so long constructing. Easier because I finally understood that some kinds of safety were just elaborate forms of dying. I asked him to stay, not because of the storm or the flooded roads or any practical consideration that would allow us both to pretend this was temporary and manageable. I asked him to stay because I wanted him there, because 20 years of careful solitude had taught me the difference between existing and living, and I was finally ready to choose the latter even if it meant risking everything I had built in service of the former. Gabriel looked at me for a long moment, his hands still resting on the half-packed bag, something like relief and joy and fear moving across his features in the dim lamplight. Then he nodded, slowly, as if he were afraid that speaking might break whatever spell had made this moment possible. It wasn't a dramatic scene, no declarations of love or promises about the future. Just two people in a quiet house, choosing each other despite all the reasons they had been given to choose otherwise. Morning came with pale light filtering through the kitchen windows, the kind of gentle illumination that makes ordinary things look touched by grace. I woke early, as I always do, but for the first time in years it wasn't because of habit or obligation. It was because something in me was eager to see what this new day might bring, what it might feel like to wake up in a world where I had chosen connection over safety, truth over the comfortable lies that had sustained me for so long. Gabriel's bag sat by the front door, still packed, but no longer waiting for departure. Sometime during the night, after our quiet conversation, after the decision that changed everything, he had carried it there and left it zipped but not lifted, like a question that had been answered without being asked. When I came downstairs, I moved it to the closet under the stairs, not ceremonially, but practically, the way you put away winter coats when spring finally arrives. I made coffee for two, the ritual that had become natural over the past week, but now carried different weight, different meaning. Gabriel appeared in the doorway as I was setting his cup on the counter, his hair still disheveled from sleep, wearing the same clothes he had worn yesterday, but somehow looking different in the morning light. More present, maybe. More permanent. There was something in his expression that I hadn't seen before, a kind of settled peace that spoke of decisions made and accepted. We didn't talk much at first, just moved around each other in the kitchen with the easy familiarity of people who had learned to share space without collision. He buttered toast while I scrambled eggs. I poured orange juice while he found plates and napkins. Small domestic choreography that felt both new and ancient, as if we were remembering steps to a dance we had once known but hadn't performed in 20 years. Outside, the world looked washed clean by the storm, everything bright and sharp-edged in the morning sun. My backyard, which had been a muddy disaster just yesterday, was already showing signs of recovery. The grass would need cutting soon, the garden beds would need weeding, and there were probably tree branches to clear from the driveway. Normal weekend tasks that suddenly felt different because I wouldn't be doing them alone. As we sat at the kitchen table eating breakfast, Gabriel mentioned practical things. The fence repair he hadn't quite finished, the loose gutter on the north side of the house that he had noticed but hadn't had time to fix. He spoke about these projects not as obligations he was trying to fulfill before leaving, but as ongoing concerns, problems that could be addressed over time by someone who planned to be around for their solutions. It was a small shift in language, but it carried enormous weight. Later, while Gabriel was outside assessing the storm damage to my roof, I found myself in the living room looking through a box of photographs that I hadn't touched in years. Most were pictures of Elise and Sophie, family gatherings and birthday parties that documented the quiet progression of years. But near the bottom of the box, tucked between Christmas photos from 2019 and a picture of my grandmother's garden, I found something that made me stop breathing for a moment. It was a photograph from our senior year of high school, taken at the annual town fair by someone whose name I couldn't remember. Gabriel and I stood side by side in front of the Ferris wheel, 17 years old and unconsciously leaning toward each other in the way that young people do when they're more connected than they realize. My hair was longer then, his face rounder, but there was something in our expressions that spoke of understanding, of recognition, of the kind of connection that transcends rivalry or friendship or any other category we might have used to describe what we meant to each other. I studied the photograph for a long time, trying to remember what we had been talking about when it was taken, what had made us both smile in that unguarded way. We looked happy, I realized, not just content or polite, but genuinely happy in each other's company, as if we had found something rare and valuable and were trying not to let it slip away. When Gabriel came back inside, his hands dirty from examining gutters and checking roof shingles, I was still sitting at the kitchen table with the photograph in front of me. He washed his hands at the sink and then came to look over my shoulder, his presence warm and solid behind my chair. For a moment, neither of us spoke, just looked at these younger versions of ourselves, these boys who had been trying so hard to figure out who they were supposed to become. Gabriel picked up the photograph, held it carefully by the edges, and studied it with the same intensity he had always brought to things that mattered to him. There was something almost like wonder in his expression, as if he were seeing not just our younger selves, but also the possibility of who we might still become, the future that had seemed impossible 20 years ago, but was suddenly, quietly, within reach. He set the photograph back on the table between us, but gently, the way you handle something precious that you don't want to damage. Then he looked at me, and in his eyes I saw not the desperate hope of someone trying to reclaim the past, but the steady warmth of someone ready to build something new from the foundation of what had always been true between us. Outside, the church bells began to ring, marking 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning in late October. The sound carried across the town as it had for over 100 years, calling people to worship or simply marking time, depending on what they needed from it. Gabriel and I sat at my kitchen table and listened to the bells fade into the distance. Two men no longer young, but not yet old, finally ready to stop running from the truth of what we had always meant to each other. The photograph remained on the table between us, edges curled and colors faded, but still capturing something essential about who we had been and who we were becoming. Later, I would find a frame for it and put it on the mantelpiece in the living room, the first picture of people I loved that had graced those walls in years. But for now, it simply lay there in the morning light, bearing witness to the quiet revolution of two lives finally, carefully, choosing each other.